Europe remembers Napoleon Bonaparte in sharply contradictory ways. In France, he is often praised as a nation builder who restored order after revolutionary chaos. Across much of Europe, he is remembered as a conqueror whose wars left millions dead. He crowned himself emperor after a revolution fought against monarchy, yet introduced legal reforms that still shape modern states. He spoke the language of liberty while ruling through censorship, secret police, and military force. Even his contemporaries struggled to decide whether he was the savior of revolutionary ideals or their ultimate betrayal. This contradiction raises uncomfortable questions. Was Napoleon driven by vision or by ambition? Did his reforms genuinely serve the people or merely strengthen his personal power? And did Europe suffer under him unnecessarily, or was it transformed in ways that could not have occurred otherwise? In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. Napoleon Bonaparte did not emerge from ancient nobility or inherited power. He was born in Corsica in 1769, just 1 year after the island became French, into a family that was minor, indebted, and politically uncertain. His early life was shaped by a sense of being an outsider. At French military schools, he spoke with an accent and came from a peripheral province, not the heart of the kingdom. Yet he absorbed the Enlightenment ideas circulating at the time: merit, rational order, and the belief that ability should outweigh birth. These ideas would later become central to how he justified his rule. The French Revolution created the conditions for Napoleon's rise. The old monarchy collapsed under financial strain, social inequality, and political paralysis. What followed was not immediate freedom and stability, but years of upheaval, executions, factional violence, foreign invasions, and economic chaos. By the mid-1790s, many French citizens were exhausted by revolution. They wanted security, bread, and order more than ideological purity. This context is essential. Napoleon did not seize a peaceful republic. He stepped into a power vacuum created by instability and fear. As a young artillery officer, Napoleon demonstrated an unusual combination of technical skill, ambition, and political instinct. His defense of the revolutionary government against royalist uprisings in Paris brought him to national attention. Soon after, his Italian campaign transformed him into a public hero. He defeated larger armies through speed, maneuver, and aggressive tactics, while presenting himself as a liberator spreading revolutionary ideals. Yet even during these early campaigns, a pattern emerged. Napoleon spoke of freedom and republicanism, but he governed occupied territories with tight control, extracting resources and suppressing dissent. By 1799, France was governed by the Directory, a weak and corrupt regime that had lost public confidence. Napoleon returned from Egypt despite an inconclusive campaign and positioned himself as the man capable of restoring stability. The coup of 18 Brumaire was not a spontaneous uprising, but a carefully orchestrated transfer of power. Napoleon presented it as a rescue of the revolution from incompetence. Many accepted this explanation. France wanted order, and Napoleon promised it. Once in power as first consul, Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate authority. He centralized administration, reformed taxation, stabilized currency, and reconciled with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801. This agreement restored religious peace by recognizing Catholicism as the religion of the majority while keeping the Church subordinate to the state. To many French citizens, this was not tyranny but relief. After years of persecution and chaos, religion returned without the return of clerical dominance. Perhaps Napoleon's most enduring legacy lies in legal reform. The Civil Code, later known as the Napoleonic Code, standardized laws across France. It abolished feudal privileges, guaranteed equality before the law, protected property rights, and promoted merit over birth. These principles spread across Europe through conquest and influence, shaping legal systems long after Napoleon's fall. Supporters argue that this alone qualifies him as a visionary reformer. Yet critics note that the same code limited women's rights, reinforced patriarchal authority, and prioritized order over individual freedom. Napoleon also reshaped education, creating state-run schools designed to train loyal administrators and officers. Advancement was based increasingly on ability rather than lineage. In theory, this fulfilled revolutionary ideals. In practice, loyalty to the regime mattered as much as merit. Napoleon rewarded supporters generously, creating a new elite bound to him personally. Titles of nobility returned, not as feudal relics, but as instruments of loyalty. The revolution had destroyed one aristocracy. Napoleon constructed another. The transformation from consul to emperor in 1804 marked a decisive moment. Napoleon justified his coronation by arguing that stability required permanence. A republic, he claimed, was vulnerable to faction and collapse. An empire could preserve revolutionary gains. The ceremony itself was carefully staged. By crowning himself rather than being crowned by the Pope, Napoleon symbolically claimed authority from the people, not divine right. Yet symbolism could not erase the reality that France had returned to one-man rule. From this point forward, the line between reformer and tyrant became increasingly blurred. Censorship expanded, newspapers were shut down, and political opposition was closely monitored. Elections continued, but were carefully managed. Napoleon argued that freedom without order led to terror and civil war. Many agreed, but this logic also justified repression. Liberty was redefined as obedience to a rational state, embodied in the emperor himself. Abroad, Napoleon's wars transformed Europe. Some regions experienced the end of feudalism and the introduction of modern administration. Others endured occupation, conscription, and economic exploitation. Napoleon claimed to export the principles of the revolution, yet his empire increasingly functioned as a system designed to support France's military and economic dominance. The continental system, intended to weaken Britain, damaged European economies and bred resentment among allies and subjects alike. This raises an important question. Were Napoleon's wars a necessary defense against hostile monarchies determined to crush revolutionary France, or did they become wars of expansion driven by personal ambition? Early on, France was undeniably under threat. Coalitions formed to restore the old order. But over time, Napoleon moved from defending borders to redrawing the map of Europe. His brothers were placed on thrones, not to promote republicanism, but to secure loyalty. Napoleon believed deeply in his own destiny. His correspondence reveals a man convinced that history had chosen him to reshape Europe. This belief fueled extraordinary energy and innovation, but also intolerance of limits. When compromise threatened his vision, he chose force. Victories reinforced his sense of inevitability. Setbacks hardened his resolve. The same qualities that made him a reformer, confidence, decisiveness, and ambition, also pushed him toward authoritarian rule. By the time Europe mobilized against him again, Napoleon stood at the center of a vast empire built on military success and administrative reform. Whether this empire represented progress or oppression depended largely on where one stood. To supporters, he was the architect of modern governance. To enemies, he was a tyrant cloaked in revolutionary language. Understanding Napoleon requires holding these contradictions together rather than resolving them too quickly. He was neither a simple despot nor a pure visionary. His reforms were real, lasting, and influential. His authoritarianism was also real, expanding alongside his power. As his rule continued, the tension between these two identities would only deepen, shaping both his greatest achievements and his ultimate downfall. As Napoleon's power expanded beyond France's borders, the contradictions at the heart of his rule became more visible and more consequential. What had begun as an effort to stabilize a revolutionary state increasingly took on the character of continental domination. Yet even here, the story is not simply one of naked ambition. Europe at the turn of the 19th century was not a neutral landscape. Monarchies viewed revolutionary France as an existential threat, and war was already the norm before Napoleon became emperor. The question then is not whether conflict was inevitable, but how Napoleon chose to fight it and what he chose to build in its aftermath. Napoleon's early wars were widely perceived within France as defensive. Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia had all intervened against revolutionary France in the 1990s. Victory was framed as survival. Napoleon used this context skillfully, presenting himself as the shield protecting the revolution's gains. Each victory strengthened this narrative and reinforced his authority at home. Success on the battlefield translated into political legitimacy. In a society exhausted by instability, military triumph became proof of competence. But as France's borders expanded, motives subtly shifted. Territories annexed or occupied by French armies were reorganized according to Napoleonic principles. Feudal privileges were abolished, guilds dismantled, legal equality proclaimed, and centralized administration imposed. In places like northern Italy, parts of Germany, and the Low Countries, many welcomed these changes. Local elites who had long chafed under fragmented authority saw opportunity in rational governance. For them, Napoleon appeared not as a tyrant, but as a modernizer. Yet reform arrived alongside occupation. French officials replaced local rulers. Taxes increased to fund war. Young men were conscripted into armies fighting far from home. Censorship and surveillance followed administration. What looked like liberation from feudalism often felt like subjugation to a foreign power. Napoleon's system demanded loyalty first and reform second. Where loyalty faltered, repression followed. The creation of satellite states reveals this duality clearly. Kingdoms in Italy, Spain, and Germany were ruled by Napoleon's relatives or trusted generals. Officially, these regimes were meant to stabilize regions and spread enlightened governance. In practice, they functioned as extensions of French power. Their survival depended on French military support, and their policies were shaped by Paris. This arrangement blurred the line between reformist empire and dynastic ambition. Spain became a turning point. Unlike other regions, Spain reacted violently to French intervention. Napoleon's decision to depose the Spanish monarchy and install his brother Joseph was justified as an effort to modernize a stagnant state. But the Spanish population did not see reform, they saw occupation. Guerrilla warfare erupted, draining French resources and exposing the limits of military control. The Peninsular War demonstrated that administrative efficiency could not compensate for the absence of legitimacy. This conflict forced a reckoning. Napoleon's model worked best where elites cooperated and populations were fragmented or politically disengaged. Where national identity and popular resistance were strong, reform imposed from above collapsed into brutality. The war in Spain was marked by reprisals, executions, and civilian suffering on a scale that shocked Europe. British observers seized on these events to portray Napoleon as a tyrant indistinguishable from the despots he claimed to replace. At home, Napoleon responded to mounting pressure with greater control. Censorship tightened further. The number of newspapers was reduced dramatically, and those that remained were carefully supervised. Art and literature were harnessed to glorify the regime. Portraits depicted Napoleon as lawgiver, peacemaker, and heir to Rome. This was not merely vanity, it was political strategy. Napoleon understood that legitimacy required narrative as much as law. The economy also reflected his governing philosophy. Napoleon favored state direction and regulation over free market chaos. Infrastructure projects expanded, roads improved, and trade standardized. These measures strengthened the state and facilitated commerce, but they also reinforced central authority. The continental system, designed to economically isolate Britain, revealed the limits of this approach. Intended as a strategic masterstroke, it disrupted European trade networks and harmed allies more than enemies. Smuggling flourished, resentment grew, and enforcement required increasingly coercive measures. Here again, intent and outcome diverged. Napoleon sought to defeat Britain without endless war. Instead, he imposed economic hardship across Europe and undermined support for his rule. The system exposed a recurring pattern. Rational plans conceived at the center produced unpredictable consequences on the periphery. When reality resisted, Napoleon responded not with retreat, but with further assertion of control. This pattern reached its peak in the invasion of Russia in 1812. Officially, the campaign aimed to compel Tsar Alexander I to comply with the continental system. Diplomatically, it was framed as enforcing agreements. Strategically, it was a gamble rooted in Napoleon's confidence in decisive action. He had defeated every major European army before. There was little reason in his mind to believe Russia would be different. Yet the Russian campaign revealed the limits of vision untempered by restraint. Distance, climate, logistics, and Russian strategy combined to devastate the Grande Armée. The catastrophic retreat shattered the myth of invincibility. More importantly, it altered how Napoleon was perceived across Europe. Former allies reconsidered their loyalty. Reform no longer seemed inevitable. Resistance became conceivable. In the aftermath, Napoleon still attempted to frame his rule as necessary and progressive. He offered constitutions, promised reforms, and appealed to shared interests. But the balance had shifted. The costs of his system now outweighed its benefits for many Europeans. Administrative modernization could not justify endless war and sacrifice. The same reforms at once appeared enlightened were now associated with conscription lists and tax collectors. What emerges from this period is not a simple transformation from reformer to tyrant, but an accumulation of contradictions. Napoleon genuinely believed in rational governance, legal equality, and meritocracy. He also believed that these goals justified extraordinary concentration of power in his hands. When reform required consent, he preferred efficiency. When resistance emerged, he chose force. His vision of progress left little room for pluralism or autonomy. This raises another important question. Can reform imposed through coercion truly be called reform? Napoleon's legacy suggests that modernization without participation creates fragile structures. Laws can be enforced, institutions replicated, but legitimacy cannot be manufactured indefinitely. Napoleon built systems that worked brilliantly while supported by success. Once success faltered, their authoritarian foundations were exposed. By the time Europe rose against him again, Napoleon faced not just foreign armies, but the cumulative consequences of his own methods. The reforms he introduced would outlast him, embedded in legal codes and administrative practices across the continent. Yet so would the memory of war, occupation, and repression. Whether he is remembered as tyrant or visionary depends not on denying one side of this record, but on understanding how deeply the two were intertwined. As his empire began to fracture, the tension between Napoleon the reformer and Napoleon the ruler for life would become impossible to contain. The final phase of his career would force Europe and Napoleon himself to confront the ultimate limits of vision enforced by power. As Napoleon's military dominance began to erode after 1812, the nature of his rule entered its most revealing phase. Success had long masked the structural weaknesses of his system. Victory justified authority, and reforms softened the image of coercion. Defeat removed that protective layer. What remained was a regime heavily dependent on centralized power, personal loyalty, and constant mobilization. This period forces a deeper examination of whether Napoleon's vision could ever survive without war, or whether war itself had become the engine that sustained his authority. The collapse of the Russian campaign was not merely a military disaster, it was a political shockwave. The Grande Armée had been the backbone of Napoleon's empire, symbolizing both reformist modernity and imperial strength. Its destruction exposed how fragile that empire truly was. States that had accepted French dominance out of necessity or calculation now saw opportunity in resistance. Prussia, long humiliated, mobilized national sentiment. Austria hedged its allegiance. Smaller German states reconsidered their dependence. Napoleon now faced coalitions motivated not only by fear, but by exhaustion. At this stage, Napoleon intensified his appeal to revolutionary legitimacy. He portrayed himself once again as the defender of the principles of 1789 against reactionary monarchies. Proclamations emphasized equality before the law, the abolition of feudal privilege, and resistance to aristocracy restoration. This rhetoric was not entirely cynical. Napoleon genuinely believed that his rule preserved the revolution's achievements, but the context had changed. For many Europeans, especially outside France, the revolution now appeared inseparable from French domination. Ideals that once promised emancipation had become associated with foreign rule and endless war. Inside France, the mood was shifting as well. Years of conscription had drained villages of young men. Taxes remained high, trade disruptions hurt livelihoods. The same administrative efficiency that had once brought stability now felt intrusive. Police surveillance extended into everyday life. Dissent was no longer sporadic, it was widespread, though often silent. Napoleon's regime still functioned, but it no longer inspired the confidence it once had. Yet, even in decline, Napoleon demonstrated remarkable resilience. His ability to mobilize resources, inspire troops, and outmaneuver opponents remained formidable. The campaigns of 1813 and early 1814 showed flashes of his old brilliance, but these were defensive battles fought against overwhelming odds. Each victory delayed defeat, but did not alter the underlying imbalance. The coalition's strength lay not only in numbers, but in shared determination to end Napoleonic dominance. This moment highlights a crucial aspect of Napoleon's character. He was exceptionally adaptive tactically, but far less so strategically. His system allowed little room for compromise. Power flowed from the center outward, and retreat, political or territorial, was perceived as weakness. This rigidity limited diplomatic options. While his opponents increasingly coordinated and adjusted their goals, Napoleon struggled to imagine a Europe not shaped by his leadership. When Paris fell in 1814, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. The narrative of tyrant versus reformer reached a temporary resolution. European powers sought to restore balance, not revolution. The Congress of Vienna aimed to stabilize the continent by restoring monarchies and redrawing borders. On the surface, this appeared to confirm Napoleon's critics. His empire had collapsed and traditional rulers returned. Yet beneath this restoration lay a paradox. Many of Napoleon's reforms were quietly retained. Legal codes inspired by the Napoleonic model remained in place across Europe. Administrative centralization, merit-based bureaucracy, and secular governments did not disappear with him. even states that opposed Napoleon adopted aspects of his system. This suggests that his vision had genuine appeal beyond coercion. The problem was not reform itself, but the means by which it had been enforced and sustained. Napoleon's dramatic return during the 100 Days further complicates his legacy. When he escaped Elba and marched back to Paris, he was welcomed by many soldiers and civilians. This was not the response one would expect for a universally hated tyrant. His return reveals lingering loyalty and belief, particularly among those who had benefited from his meritocratic system or feared the return of the old aristocracy. Napoleon attempted to reinvent himself once more, offering a more liberal constitution and pledging restraint. Whether this transformation was sincere or tactical remains debated. The final defeat at Waterloo ended these questions decisively. Napoleon's exile to St. Helena removed him from European politics, but not from history. In isolation, he became his own historian. His dictated memoirs framed his career as a tragic struggle between enlightened progress and reactionary forces. He portrayed himself as a man ahead of his time, misunderstood and constrained by hostile powers. This self-portrait deeply influenced later interpretations, particularly in France, where nostalgia for stability and glory softened memories of repression. At the same time, opposing narratives solidified elsewhere. In Britain and parts of Central Europe, Napoleon was remembered primarily as a despot whose ambition plunged the continent into war. This divergence in memory is telling. It reflects how Napoleon's impact varied dramatically depending on local experience. Where his reforms dismantled oppressive structures, he was remembered as a liberator. Where his rule brought conscription and occupation, he was remembered as a tyrant. This split memory raises an essential question about historical judgment. Should leaders be evaluated by intentions, outcomes, or methods? Napoleon's intentions often aligned with Enlightenment principles. His outcomes included lasting legal and administrative change. His methods relied heavily on coercion, censorship, and war. These elements cannot be separated neatly. His vision required power. His power reshaped his vision. Napoleon's story also challenges simplistic definitions of tyranny. Unlike traditional despots, he did not rule solely for personal indulgence or arbitrary cruelty. He believed in order, rationality, and progress. Yet his intolerance of opposition and concentration of authority produced many of the same effects as classical tyranny. Freedom was conditional, participation was limited. The state existed to implement a vision, not to negotiate it. By the time Napoleon disappeared into exile, Europe was irrevocably changed. The old order had been shaken beyond repair. Even restored monarchies ruled differently than before. Constitutions, legal equality, and centralized administration became the norm rather than the exception. In this sense, Napoleon's influence outlived his power, but so did the trauma of his wars. Millions were dead, economies were strained, entire regions bore the scars of conflict. Understanding Napoleon at this stage requires accepting contradiction without resolution. He was not a failed tyrant whose defeat erased his impact, nor a misunderstood reformer betrayed by circumstance. He was a product of revolutionary upheaval who imposed order through force, and in doing so, transformed Europe while exhausting it. His fall was not simply the result of external opposition, but of the internal limits of a system that depended too heavily on one man. As Europe moved into the post-Napoleonic era, the question of his legacy remained unresolved. Was stability achieved by rejecting his model or by absorbing it selectively? And was Napoleon's failure proof that vision enforced through domination is unsustainable, or merely that even extraordinary individuals face limits? To answer these questions, we must look not only at his fall, but how Europe remembered, adapted, and debated his legacy long after he was gone. As Europe settled into the post-Napoleonic order, the struggle to define Napoleon's legacy began almost immediately. His absence did not bring clarity, it intensified debate. Governments that had fought him now faced a dilemma. They wanted to erase his dominance, yet they could not undo the changes his rule had embedded so deeply into their societies. This contradiction shaped the 19th century. Napoleon was gone, but the world he helped create remained, forcing Europe to grapple with the uncomfortable question of whether progress had come hand in hand with coercion. The Congress of Vienna sought stability above all else. Its architects aimed to restore balance by re-establishing monarchies and containing revolutionary upheaval. On paper, this appeared to mark a rejection of Napoleonic rule, but in practice, the restoration was selective. Few rulers attempted to revive feudal systems in their old forms. Legal equality before the law, centralized administration, and professional bureaucracies were largely retained. Even those who despised Napoleon recognized the efficiency of the structures he had imposed. This selective retention reveals something crucial. Napoleon's reforms were not dismissed because they were unpopular. They were criticized because they were associated with domination. Once separated from French military power, many of these reforms became acceptable, even desirable. The modern state that emerged across Europe borrowed heavily from the Napoleonic model while rejecting the concentration of authority that had enforced it. In this sense, Napoleon's failure did not invalidate his vision. It exposed the dangers of tying that vision too closely to one individual. In France, the debate was especially intense. The Bourbon monarchy returned, but it ruled a fundamentally different country than the one overthrown in 1789. The civil code remained. Careers based on merit continued. The old nobility could not simply reclaim its former privileges. Napoleon's supporters, many of whom occupied administrative and military positions, were too numerous to ignore. This created a political culture permanently shaped by Napoleonic compromise, monarchy constrained by law, authority balanced uneasily with revolutionary legacy. Napoleon himself became a symbol onto which competing political movements projected their values. Liberals admired his destruction of feudal privilege and promotion of equality before the law. Nationalists admired his ability to mobilize and unify populations. Conservatives condemned his disruption of traditional authority and moral order. Even socialists would later draw lessons from his centralized state. Rarely has a single historical figure been claimed by so many opposing ideologies. This symbolic power was amplified by Napoleon's own role in shaping his memory. On St. Helena, he dictated memoirs designed not simply to recount events, but to explain them. He framed himself as a rational actor constrained by circumstance, repeatedly emphasizing that Europe's monarchies forced him into war. He portrayed his authoritarian measures as temporary necessities rather than ideological commitments. These writings were widely read after his death and played a major role in softening his image, particularly in France. Yet memoirs cannot fully explain outcomes. The lived experience of Napoleonic rule varied too widely. In parts of Italy and Germany, the dismantling of fragmented feudal systems laid foundations for later national unification. In these regions, Napoleon appeared retrospectively as an accelerant of history, forcing changes that local elites had resisted for centuries. But in Spain, Portugal, and parts of Eastern Europe, his legacy was overwhelmingly negative. There, modernization was associated with invasion, repression, and devastation. This uneven legacy highlights a central tension in evaluating Napoleon. Reform is rarely neutral. It benefits some groups while harming others. Napoleon's reforms empowered the state and those aligned with it. They weakened traditional intermediaries, churches, guilds, local aristocracies that had once mediated power. For some, this meant liberation from entrenched inequality. For others, it meant exposure to a distant, impersonal authority with little room for local autonomy. The question of tyranny becomes especially complex here. Tyranny is often defined not only by repression, but by the absence of accountability. Napoleon ruled through plebiscites and legal frameworks, but these mechanisms were carefully managed. Participation existed, but choice was constrained. Dissent was tolerated only within narrow limits. Napoleon believed deeply that he understood the general will better than the public itself. This conviction justified concentration of power in his hands. At the same time, it is difficult to ignore that many willingly accepted this trade-off. After decades of revolution, terror, and instability, Napoleon offered predictability. Roads functioned, courts worked, the state paid salaries on time. For ordinary citizens, this mattered more than abstract political freedom. This willingness to exchange participation for stability complicates any simple classification of Napoleon as a tyrant. His authority rested not only on force, but on consent, shaped by exhaustion and fear of chaos. Internationally, Napoleon's legacy reshaped how Europe thought about war and governance. His campaigns demonstrated the power of mass conscription, national armies, and centralized logistics. Warfare became total in a way it had not been before. States learned from this, adopting similar methods, even as they condemned him. The 19th century's great powers would all build systems influenced by Napoleonic practice, from staff planning to legal uniformity. This influence extended beyond Europe. Legal codes inspired by the Napoleonic model spread to Latin America, the Middle East, and parts of Asia through colonization and reform movements. In many cases, these codes outlived colonial rule, becoming foundations of modern legal systems. This global impact reinforces the argument that Napoleon was not merely a conqueror, but a transmitter of a particular vision of order, one rooted in law, hierarchy, and centralized authority. Still, this vision carried inherent risks. By prioritizing efficiency over participation, it created states strong enough to govern, but not always flexible enough to adapt. Later European revolutions would challenge precisely this model, demanding broader political inclusion. In that sense, Napoleon solved some problems of the old order while planting seeds for future conflict. His system stabilized societies temporarily, but postponed deeper questions about representation and rights. As historians continue to debate Napoleon, the focus increasingly shifts from judgment to understanding. He cannot be reduced to a moral caricature without losing the complexity of his impact, nor can he be celebrated uncritically without acknowledging the suffering his wars inflicted. The more closely one examines his rule, the clearer it becomes that tyranny and reform were not opposing paths for Napoleon, but intertwined strategies. By the mid-19th century, Europe had largely absorbed Napoleon's legacy, even as it tried to forget the man himself. His name remained shorthand for ambition, genius, and excess. His reforms became invisible, normalized as features of modern governance. This separation between memory and structure is perhaps the clearest measure of his influence. He failed to build a lasting empire, but he succeeded in reshaping how power operated. As we move toward the final phase of Napoleon's story, the question becomes less about whether he was tyrant or visionary, and more about what his career reveals about power itself. Can reform imposed from above create lasting progress? Is stability worth the cost of political freedom? And do extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary authority? Napoleon's life does not answer these questions definitively, but it forces us to confront them. The final assessment of Napoleon Bonaparte's life cannot rest on simple verdicts. By the time he was exiled for the second and final time, Europe was exhausted, reshaped, and permanently altered. His fall did not signal a return to the old world, nor did it validate the revolutionary ideals in their purest form. Instead, it marked the end of a unique experiment in power, one that fused Enlightenment rationality with personal domination, reform with coercion, and vision with violence. Napoleon's final years force us to confront the limits of ambition. After his escape from Elba and the dramatic return during the 100 Days, it became clear that his authority no longer rested on inevitability. The France he returned to was not the France he had left. War weariness had replaced enthusiasm. The army was loyal, but thinner, older, and less confident. Europe, meanwhile, had learned how to fight him. Waterloo was not simply a military defeat, it was the collapse of the aura that had sustained his rule. This collapse exposes a crucial truth about Napoleon's system. It depended heavily on his personal presence. While he built institutions, laws, and administrative frameworks, they functioned best when animated by his direct control. Once removed, the system lacked a clear mechanism for self-correction or renewal. Unlike constitutional systems that distribute authority, Napoleon's model concentrated legitimacy in the individual. When that individual failed, the structure could not sustain itself independently. Yet, even in defeat, Napoleon's influence did not disappear. His enemies did not dismantle his reforms because they could not. The centralized state, professional bureaucracy, legal uniformity, and secular administration were too efficient to abandon. What vanished was not the system, but the justification for one-man rule. Europe kept the machinery while rejecting the man who had wielded it so absolutely. This distinction matters when judging whether Napoleon was a tyrant or a visionary reformist. Tyrants rarely leave behind systems that others willingly preserve. Visionaries rarely rely so extensively on censorship, surveillance, and war. Napoleon fits uneasily into both categories because he embodied a historical transition. He was neither a medieval despot nor a modern democrat. He stood at the crossroads, borrowing from both worlds, belonging fully to neither. Napoleon believed sincerely in order. He feared fragmentation, disorder, and ideological extremism. His experience during the French Revolution convinced him that unchecked popular power could be just as destructive as absolute monarchy. This belief shaped his governing philosophy. He saw himself not as an oppressor, but as a stabilizer, a necessary force to channel revolutionary energy into productive structures. From his perspective, freedom without discipline led to chaos. But intention does not erase consequence. The human cost of Napoleon's wars was staggering. Millions died across Europe. Entire regions were economically devastated. Generations grew up defined by conscription and loss. These outcomes cannot be dismissed as unfortunate side effects. They were the direct result of a system that equated national greatness with continuous expansion. Napoleon's vision required constant victory to survive. When victory became impossible, collapse followed. The moral ambiguity of Napoleon's legacy lies precisely here. His reforms improved lives in measurable ways, standardized laws, reduced arbitrary privilege, expanded access to careers, and strengthened state capacity. At the same time, these gains were delivered through a regime that suppressed dissent and demanded sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. Progress and suffering advanced together, inseparable in practice. Over time, historical judgment has shifted away from asking whether Napoleon was good or evil and toward understanding why he was possible. His rise reflected structural conditions, revolutionary upheaval, institutional collapse, external threat, and social exhaustion. Napoleon did not invent these forces, he mastered them. In doing so, he revealed how quickly societies will accept concentrated power when stability is at stake. This insight gives Napoleon lasting relevance. Modern states continue to wrestle with the same tension he embodied: efficiency versus accountability, security versus liberty, central authority versus pluralism. Napoleon's career demonstrates both the appeal and the danger of decisive leadership unrestrained by durable checks. He shows how easily reform can slide into domination when power lacks limits. His personal contradictions mirror this broader tension. He promoted merit but created a new elite. He ended feudal privilege but crowned himself emperor. He claimed to defend the revolution but silenced its principles when they threatened his control. These were not accidental inconsistencies. They were the logical outcomes of trying to impose rational order on a society still emotionally shaped by revolution. Napoleon's genius lay in his ability to act decisively within uncertainty. His failure lay in believing that decisiveness alone could replace legitimacy. His systems he built required participation to endure, but he trusted command more than consensus. This imbalance ultimately defined his downfall. The moment obedience faltered, the structure unraveled. Yet history rarely deals in clean lessons. Napoleon's shadow remains long because his achievements were real and durable. Modern Europe, with its codified laws, professional administrations, and centralized states, owes part of its shape to him. To deny this is to misunderstand how deeply his influence runs. At the same time, the suffering caused by his ambition warns against romanticizing strong rule, no matter how enlightened its intentions appear. So, was Napoleon a tyrant or a visionary reformist? The answer lies not at one end of the spectrum, but in the uncomfortable space between. He was a visionary who believed reform required force, a ruler who equated order with obedience, a product of revolution who sought to end it by controlling its outcomes. His legacy forces us to accept that history's most transformative figures are often its most destructive. In the end, Napoleon did not resolve the conflict between authority and freedom. He intensified it, dramatized it, and passed it on to the modern world. His life stands as a case study in how power reshapes ideals, and how ideals, once reshaped, can justify power. That unresolved tension is why Napoleon remains endlessly debated, not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror reflecting the dilemmas of governance that still confront us today.